FreeBSD. Eirik, the floor is yours.
Do you guys hear me? Yes. Cool. Excellent. So, hello. This is my second time here. This is exciting. I don't know why this keeps happening to me. Welcome to the blame game. I want to cover a few things. Basically, I want to talk about the world that me and my company live in, and a bit of a history of security standards that apply to us. Some of you will find some of them familiar. I want to cover a bit about shit auditors say. The current state of affairs in the industry. More stuff they say. A bit of how we approach everything. And the toolbox that we use. And maybe a couple of tips and tricks for anyone who might be interested. I suspect there will be a bit of questions afterwards. So I'm here, personally. It's because I've been using FreeBSD since around 2000. I really, really love open source and the whole communities that, all the communities that form around it, well, most of them anyway. I landed in the BSD camp. Others may have different fortunes. I've been working in the payment industry for a while now, since 2003. That's like, what is it, 21 years, which is crazy. It was Wild West back then, and now it's still Wild West, just a bit more organized. Hence, Westworld. I talk about these things a lot if people don't stop me. Usually there's beer involved, and people may or may not care. But now I'm here, so sorry. And why are we here? Well, my current employer is in the top corner there. When I was here last, I represented a company called Modern. We have since been gobbled up by a much larger company, Intersect. But our history goes back to 2003 when the software that we host was implemented and run on FreeBSD. And we have been authenticating users during online payments. So if you ever used your credit card online and you've been asked to authenticate, SMS, OTP, or password, or anything like that, that would be us or one of our handful of competitors. So basically, the software for the card issuers, so the bank that issues the card, and software for merchants, and processors like Amazon, PayPal, etc. That's the software that we host on behalf of some of these companies. And the protocol involved is called 3D Secure. And sadly, it's not VR or anything like that. That would be much more fun. It's 3-domain security. It's supposedly a well-established approach to security. And the protocol, it allows banks to intercept the payment process. This is obviously only online payments, to authenticate you as a cardholder. It's sold as a benefit to you, but really what's happening is that the bank is getting rid of responsibility. They're trying to push that over to you. At the same time, the merchants who 20 years ago took most of the risk when you bought stuff from them with a card, they now get rid of a lot of this liability. The idea being that if the merchant allows for this authentication to take place, so invites your bank into the process, then most of the situations where fraud would be committed are now the bank's responsibility. So the merchant no longer has to suffer if you buy a computer with a stolen card. The banks will actually pay the merchant, and the bank sits there with the loss. You may have noticed, if you have cards from multiple banks, that they have different ways of doing this, that they have different authentication methods. It can be, as I said, SMS OTP, it can be some app that they trigger, some out-of-band authentication of some kind. This has been changing a lot over the years. and each bank chooses their own thing, typically. And to avoid inconveniencing you too much, they also have started using this risk-based authentication. And that's actually something that the EU wants them to do through the PSD2 directives. They want risk assessments to be made every time you pay, so that you maybe don't have to go through the full authentication every time. So apparently, this is what we do. Sometimes I wish I was actually doing something useful for the world. Well, we live in a world where there are three key players. You have those who write the requirements. That would be typically the payment systems like Visa, MasterCard, Discover, those guys. They tend to have some middlemen between them and us to make it look different. It's the people who are covering their asses, like all of them, and then it's us. We have a whole bunch of security requirements and others that we need to deal with. You have, obviously, the PCI DSS and PCI 3DS, Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard. I guess many of you heard of it. And there's a tack on to that one called the PCI 3DS, which is specifically to those who host these key components of the authentication system. So then we also have requirements that are maybe the same, maybe not, that come directly from the payment systems. That tends to get confusing. Then you have the legal requirements that sometimes they do a good thing, sometimes they just muddy the waters even further. Especially local law tends to be really nasty on that one, but not as nasty as customer requirements. I don't know how many of you have ever filled out a security compliance questionnaire from a client. They tend to be copied and pasted from various sources, including the PCI, of course. So us shoving the PCI compliance letter in their faces doesn't really help because they don't know what it means, which is kind of sad. So let's start in the early 2000s. Like everything else in the IT industry, it was a bit of a Wild West back then. This would be a typical server. This would be how credit card data was stored. There were really no relevant requirements that anyone cared about. There were some early efforts by some of the card companies, but nobody even heard of them. Everyone did their own thing. I guess there was a common motivator that you didn't want to end up in the news, but then again, there was so little online shopping back then that meh. You had so much fraud. It was incredible. It was at one point I went to visit a Swiss airline. They told me that when their nearest competitor implemented 3D Secure, all the fraud landed on them. And from one day to the next, they went from 2% to 30% of the transaction volume being fraudulent, which is just mind-blowing. You would have servers under desks, on top of desks, next to desks, you know, all these things, because who could afford anything else when you had 10 transactions a day? You would have what you still have in hotels. You would have receipts with you know, full card numbers, expiry dates, maybe more, maybe your signature on it, your name, your bank name. It's incredible how much data you can fish out of these things. Crypto? What do you mean, crypto? It's not, back then, nobody knew about Bitcoin mining and that stuff, so crypto actually meant cryptography, but you did payment transactions in plain text. Crazy stuff. And then finally, we have some requirements coming. The PCI DSS showed up in 2004, best as I can figure out. Extremely immature. I cannot tell you how bad it was. I don't know if anyone's ever looked at the common criteria security requirements from, what, 60s or something? Or early 70s? I can't even remember. Those are relatively coherent. But of course, not everything would apply. PCI rather looked at how someone somewhere chose to solve the problems and then describe that. So it's extremely, extremely tied to the solutions, not to the problems that you're supposed to be solving. You had so-called auditors that were supposed to be qualified popping up everywhere. We still have that happening, like whack-a-mole. You have an auditor, they get a certification, they pop up somewhere, sell you a pre-filled paperwork, and you are suddenly compliant, and then the auditor disappears before anyone has a chance to check up on them. It was horrible. I mean, I would say today is sanity compared to back then. On top of the PCI, Visa had their own set of requirements, specifically for our industry. It focused mostly on the key management part, so basically management of cryptographic keys and the physical security around your data center. They were not completely terrible, but then they let marketing edit the documents. Yeah. So that was bad. I'll give you some more examples of how bad. They would be looking for data that cannot possibly exist. If you're doing online payments, why should I be scanning the disks of all my servers for the stripe data, the track data from the cards, you know, the magnetic stripe? They ask me to look for that on my servers at least on a daily basis. Because, you know, that's the part that would apply to a physical store. But obviously not to us. But we still had to document how we were looking for this, because there was no provision for, you know, you do this, then you look for that, etc. They required us to document our password files by taking pictures of them to show that we were encrypting the passwords. So we had the auditor in the data center insisting on taking pictures of the screen as I was showing the password file. This is my favorite. Visa even published a set of certified regular expressions to look for card data on your systems. Of course, they didn't work. But they had a program that would interpret these broken regular expressions for you that you could run on your system instead of using grep, which was never actually released, but we were asked to run them anyway. They even built a FreeBSD binary for us. But still, I couldn't see the source code, so I was like, no, I'm not running this. There's no way. I'm not taking this. We were 2 employees at the time. We had a tiny office. We were sharing a desk, but still, visitor badge system. Absolute must. We have to be able to tell if someone is a guest. Yes? For the visitor badge system. Now, to be fair, our visitor badge system was a folder with tags with numbers on them, and we would write down the number and the name of the visitor, and so on. It was fun. And we had a separate badge for the auditor, which was a badger hat. Our first audit, I will never in my life forget. The auditor connected his laptop to a projector in the conference room we were renting, and he was trying to look up something from our wiki, and he was focusing on his screen, not realizing that focus was over there on the big screen. So we saw his browser history. That was not nice. And on his desktop there were folders with our name on them, with a lot of our competitors, our clients, and everything, where he was collecting all this evidence, like pictures of the password files, for example, on this Windows XP machine. Not my card. I'm fairly sure. So in 2014, I went to visit Visa at their headquarters in London, and we were complaining that the security requirements that applied to us and everyone else in our business they were being interpreted differently in the different regions of the world. So Visa and all the other companies, they split the world in regions like Europe and Asia and whatever. And we learned that in some regions, like the US, for example, they actually had decent auditors implementing this. They would talk to you, find out what you were doing, they would focus on the reason for the security requirements, and see what you did about that. They told us, we are not qualified to assess your compensating controls, therefore we will not. Simple as that. They admitted openly, we have no idea what we're doing. If you don't do it by the letter, you fail. So we get to a point where PCI DSS is maturing a bit. It gets a bit more flexible. They start seeing that not everyone is using Windows and group policies to implement all the requirements. It focuses more on the problem than the solution, which that's something we can work with. Less tied, again, to the specific platforms. But, of course, they haven't kept up with password policies and recommendations. The separate requirements, they keep getting more and more absurd, to the point where in order to access our systems remotely, I had two choices. Either I would be in the same physical building as the server, in which case all you need is to make sure you use SSH version 2. That was literally the only requirement for remote access if you're in the same physical site. Doesn't matter if you're using your personal hotspot to access your server, doesn't matter. But if I were in my office, I would have to sit in a literal physical cage with video surveillance, keyloggers, commercial firewalls, and only power up. The machine had to be booted from read-only media every time I wanted to do remote access work, which is, of course, crazy. They were logically impossible. You know, when you take paragraphs and you move them around and you place them at the wrong indenting level, it's like working with Python. And they actively reduce security. I'll give you an example. So, nice and secure door. Your root account must have strong password under split knowledge and dual control. Fine. Not having a root account doesn't apply. That doesn't qualify. So if you don't have a root account, by disabling it or removing it entirely, that's not good enough. So what do? Sorry, I'll go back on that one because I have to finish talking about it. My colleague said what they required was the equivalent of having a concrete wall, knocking a big hole in it and putting in a really secure door that you don't need. But yeah, disabling root, not enough. You have to treat one-time passwords like they were static passwords, which means you have to encrypt them using a hardware security module, and they have to be decrypted with a hardware security module by the recipient. And just what is a hardware security module? It's one of these. How many of you have pockets that would fit one of these? So for about 1.5 years, we were not able to do SMS OTP because this was a hard requirement, but only in Europe. Not in the US, not in Asia, not in Australia, nowhere else. Setting up communications with SMS gateways and so on. I don't know how familiar you are with TLS, but it's the server that decides how strong the crypto is, largely speaking. So they actually suggested we flip the role and have the SMS gateway contact us for SMSs to send out, so that we could control how strong that crypto was. I don't even know how to explain it. So, is there sanity on the horizon somehow? In 2018, these insane requirements from Visa disappeared, luckily. They were basically built into the PCI 3DS. That's when the PCI 3DS showed up. And believe it or not, but GDPR and PSD2 actually helps, because it helps focus at least some people's efforts. And it's actually nice that we can tell an auditor that no, GDPR prevents us from collecting this information. we cannot track you the way you're expecting us to do. No, we will not have camera surveillance in our office, at my desk. I don't want keyloggers on my computer. But of course, you still have clueless or cheating auditors. That happens a lot. The payment systems, they're still meddling in all this because they don't trust the system they built. You have a lot of homegrown requirements, or, as we more and more often see, copying and pasting gone bad because people don't know how to use Excel or whatever spreadsheet they're using. We had some more interesting questions from auditors, like the type of street lamps you have outside your office. How often does the police patrol your area? I mean, is this from LA or something? I don't know. This is Oslo we're talking about, by the way. I didn't say. I'm in Oslo. We don't have police patrolling for the sake of our office. Priority phone numbers for emergency services. Why would a company have that in a civilized country? Why would my call to the police receive higher priority than someone being mugged or raped on the street? I actually took great issue with this, and the auditor was very clear that the police needed to prioritize us above everything else that happened in that general area. We're smack downtown Oslo. Come on. And then you have an auditor who decides that our data is worth a few $100 million. He puts this on a piece of paper, sticks it in his open bag, open, you know, I don't know what you call it, suitcase, which is carrying it around on the airport or whatever. So this is a piece of document from a huge bank in the US that has our company name on it and our value being $450 million or something like that. What do you think a bad guy who sees that is going to do? They're going to see, okay, what if I get 1% return on investment on attacking these people? That's a lot of money to put into a social engineering or actual hacker attack. So that is the single biggest risk we've ever been exposed to. And then that is my favorite from an auditor. I don't really understand this requirement. And then you spend maybe half an hour trying to figure out with the auditor what the requirement actually wants you to do. And this is like this year, I'm not kidding. So how do we approach this? Well, it sounds like a cliche, but we try to think security first. Because then compliance at least gets easier. We don't trust anyone, not even ourselves, because we always get something wrong. But if you know why you're doing what you're doing, and you're prepared to describe that to an auditor, why you've chosen to do something the way you do, that is an active choice, not just an accidental default configuration or something like that, it's amazing what you can get away with. And I'm not saying to cheat your way out of it, but actually get them to understand this is the proper way of doing it, because it solves the underlying problem. And I've gotten some flack for this one, that detecting someone messing with your systems is more important than preventing it from happening. Of course you should be doing both, but there are so many examples of companies who have been hacked, who have had agents in their systems for months or years, and because of not detecting them, the damage just explodes. So I still argue, start by making sure you detect it if someone messes up. A good test is, are you able to maintain your systems without tripping a wire every now and then? You can start there. And of course, dual control is extremely old-fashioned, but is also extremely effective. So our physical racks in the data center, they require two of us to get to them. And we don't have console access from the outside because we need that like once every 2 years or something. But having those keys that I can access one key, my colleague can access another, we've never been able to access each other's keys, That's actually a really nice thing to be able to document to an auditor or to someone who's just legitimately concerned. So if you can, try that. Try it in the cloud. Now, why is all this hard? As I mentioned, you have philosophies that are just incompatible. You will have one set of requirements telling you to use one approach to password security, like make sure they're long but never change them, or rarely. And then you have others who say you have to change your password every 14 days. Of course, all the requirements are written thinking they're targeting a very large organization. As I said, we were 2 when we started. Now we're a lot more, but we're still small compared to a lot of the companies who have to go through this. And I'm sure some of you will be in the same boat. It's not open source friendly. There is a built-in assumption that unless you're paying someone for a service or a product, it cannot be good enough for what you're trying to do. And that is ridiculously annoying. Very often you will be attempted sold proprietary hardware that has no drivers for the operating system you've chosen or the platform you've chosen. Typical example would be these hardware security modules. There are some of them that operate on a network level, so you can speak to them over the network, and they have a protocol you can implement easily in a shell script if you wanted. They obviously are limited by network bandwidth and such when it comes to performance, but in our case, luckily, it's mostly about key storage, not necessarily live operations. If you want to have really, really fast cryptography, you need a PCIe card or something like that, and then it starts being really hard to find drivers. Then the card selects your operating system, not the other way around. And of course, being compliant is not the same as being secure, and vice versa. Sadly, I wish it was, because interpretation of the requirements is everything. So if you can, choose your auditor wisely. A lot of companies, especially in the PCI DSS world, don't actually know they can choose their auditor, but you can. And guess who's paying the bill? It's you. So the auditor works for you, not for anyone else. Pick auditors accordingly. But how do you do that? Start by acknowledging and have the auditor acknowledge that this is a technical job. Auditing is technical. You need to make sure that the auditor has a background that is relevant to the technologies you're using. So how many FreeBSD auditors do you have out there? I found 2. But there are 2 at least. How does the auditor handle alternative solutions? This is something you need to ask up front. Now, with the latest PCI DSS version 4, there is actually it actually allows you to sort of define your own solutions to problems, but the documentation requirements are pretty insane. It's like you basically need to do a doctorate on your solution before they will accept it. So work with the auditor, make sure they're willing to work with you to understand the problem in your world and how you solved it. Will they do that? Auditors will tell you, we cannot tell you how to do something because we're supposed to audit you. Fair. But they can be there for you to run ideas by. Nothing prevents them from doing that. You can say, if I were to do this, how would that satisfy your compliance hunger? And they might actually work with you on that. Do they trust their own judgment? That's probably the biggest one, because many of the auditors we met, they, as I mentioned, they openly say they don't understand the requirements. The upshot of that is that they don't trust themselves to assess your solutions. So they have to be able to trust their own judgment and be willing to answer for the PCI Council or the payment system or whatever, whether about the stance that they've taken on your behalf. If someone warns you about an auditor, you really should listen. But if they recommend an auditor, consider yourself lucky. And again, you're the client. You're paying the bill. So at the end, you can work with that. But if you can't, if you're not able to choose your auditor, make sure you're prepared to explain your platform and your concepts as early in the process as possible. We found this to be useful, that we sit down with the auditor before they really get started and say something about who we are. Say something about how everything we do is based on open source. So set their expectations. They can't expect to find an Active Directory server in our network, controlling access or whatever it might be. Be prepared to use generic terminology, and this one might hurt a bit if you're a bit, difficult like myself. You may want to use the term VM instead of jail, or Unix, or even Linux instead of FreeBSD, because use terms that they recognize, reduce the confusion level. And if what they're auditing you against is not the PCI DSS, try to map whatever they ask for back to that, because most requirements come from the same place. And if you can connect those dots for the auditor, it very often helps to explain why you've chosen a certain approach. And they will typically know what the PCI is, but not always. So that's about it. Thank you very much, and I welcome questions. Yes, there's a question over there.
How many times did you thought of being an auditor yourself?
I have thought of it because if I would one day stumble across a sane set of requirements, it might even be fun. If I find a customer, no, but this is not even a joke. If I would find a customer who are genuinely interested in bolstering their security, I would be happy to do it. But if it's just to tick boxes, that sounds like too much pain. Back there, I think.
What is the longest amount of time that you've actually spent with an auditor, like at a single instance?
Okay, it's a bit hard to answer because, especially in the last few years, an audit typically takes 6 months from start to finish. But most of the time is not spent by me or by us typically. It's mostly the auditor actually saying, okay, give me your documents, and then they start going through it. And often it's the same thing all over again, like last year, and maybe they're doing multiple audits at once. I have spent about 2 weeks in a room with an auditor on a few occasions. But that is the absolute worst I've done, luckily.
And is that like a longer amount of time or shorter than what used to happen like 10, 15 years ago?
So the first audit we did was, I think it was 4 days or something on site, and that's when we were 2 people and 1 rack. I would say it's in the same ballpark these days, but because of the whole choosing your auditor and the maturation of the requirements, I consider ourselves to have failed an audit if we don't leave it feeling that we learned something. And that's something I should actually have mentioned, that over the years we have more often than not been lucky enough to be able to both find an auditor and frame the audit in such a way that we actually challenge ourselves and learn something from it, because then it doesn't feel like a complete waste of time.
Oh, okay. Makes sense.
If requirements become so absurd, as you say, doesn't cover your ass become a necessity to avoid legal liabilities that come with it?
Sorry, can you say that again? I didn't quite get it.
When the requirements become so absurd as you painted the picture, that it's difficult to comply with them, they don't make sense, they don't increase security, don't you need to comply in a way that covers your ass so in a way that you don't want to comply, but you need to, because otherwise you will be legally liable?
Yes. I've been fighting against exactly that all the time. Again, if there's no meaning in the requirement or in the proposed solution, you're doing something wrong. But yes, you do need to tick all the boxes, otherwise your customers will leave, your insurance premium will go up, and all these things. But there is one situation in my 20-year history, 15 years of auditing, where I can say I have lied to the auditor, and that is the whole root password thing. I have not, at any point, created a root password, split it up, and put it in 2 different safes. I said I did, and the auditor accepted that, but we didn't. We didn't have an enabled root account. So, but in other parts of the organization I'm in, especially with the whole cyber insurance thing, choosing something that ticks all the boxes without any thought of how secure it actually is quite common. An example would be that we hide one of the important admin interfaces behind an SSO, but if you know the other host name that is used to access the same service, all you need is username and password. Because we chose this solution, we have paid for it, look, show the insurance company, look, we're using this platform, and they're fine with it, but you know, it becomes too complex. So we try to avoid that. Okay. Well, thank you everyone.